It was nearly midnight when Claire hugged her best friend goodbye, stepping into the chilly embrace of the night. The streets were silent, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, with only the soft drizzle of rain adding life to the stillness. Claire slipped into the driver's seat of her car, adjusting her jacket against the cold. Driving alone at night had always been a comfort to her, a time to reflect and unwind. But tonight the usual sense of peace was replaced by an unshakable unease. The engine hummed to life, and she adjusted her rear-view mirror. That's when she thought she saw it. A flicker of movement in the back seat. She froze, her breath caught in her chest. Her eyes scanned the dark interior, her heart pounding. Nothing. A sigh escaped her lips, shaky but relieved. "It's just the shadows," she muttered to herself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the silence. The rain intensified as she pulled onto the empty road, the wipers working furiously to clear her view. The rhythmic squeak of the blades seemed to echo unnaturally loud, filling the car with a mechanical tension. To distract herself, Claire reached for the radio, but static buzzed through the speakers. She frowned, twisting the knob, but no station came through. Giving up, she turned it off, and the car was plunged into silence once more, save for the persistent tap of the rain. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling her. She glanced over and saw a text from her brother. "Safe drive. Don't pick up any hitchhikers." A small smile tugged at her lips as she typed back a quick thumbs-up emoji. She returned her attention to the road, and her stomach dropped. A dark figure stood in the middle of the street. Claire slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car skidded to a halt, stopping mere feet from the figure. Her chest heaved as she gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. She squinted through the rain, trying to make out any features, but the figure was gone. Heart pounding, she rolled down her window slightly, rain spattering her arm. "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice wavered. The only response was the soft patter of rain. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly rolled the window back up. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel and pressed the gas pedal, eager to put distance between herself and the empty road behind her. Minutes passed, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. She glanced repeatedly at the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to reappear. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, the static hissing like a venomous snake. Claire's hand darted to the dial to shut it off, but before she could, a voice emerged from the noise, low, raspy, and chillingly familiar. "You shouldn't have left me." Her blood turned to ice. She yanked the dial, silencing the voice, but the silence felt worse, suffocating and alive. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out any rational thought. She told herself it was a rogue signal, some interference from the storm. But even as she tried to believe it, the voice returned, louder, angrier. "I'm still here." A scream tore from her throat as she swerved the car, narrowly missing the ditch. Panic gripped her as she spotted a gas station, a beacon of light in the oppressive darkness. She pulled into the lot, parking haphazardly, and bolted from the car. Rain soaked her clothes as she stumbled into the small convenience store, her breath ragged and her voice trembling. "Please, you have to check my car, the back seat, someone's in there," she cried, grabbing the arm of the attendant behind the counter. The man, a wiry figure with graying hair, looked at her with wide eyes. "Calm down, lady, what's going on?" "There's someone in my car, I heard them, please just check," she pleaded. He grabbed a flashlight and followed her outside, his boots splashing in the puddles. Together, they approached the car. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as the man opened the back door and shone the light inside. Empty. The seats were dry and undisturbed. "There's no one here," he said, straightening up. His tone was kind but skeptical. "You sure you're okay?" Claire nodded, though her face burned with embarrassment. "Thank you," she murmured, climbing back into the car. The attendant watched her for a moment before returning to the store. She locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor her to reality. She wanted to believe it was all in her head, but the pit in her stomach refused to disappear. As she pulled into her driveway, the familiar sight of her home offered little comfort. She turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, gathering her nerves. Her phone buzzed again and she flinched. She picked it up, her heart pounding as she saw the notification. One new photo received. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The image on the screen made her blood run cold. It was a picture of her car taken moments ago, and in the back seat, clear as day, sat a man. His face was pale and lifeless, his sunken eyes staring directly at the camera. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the floor. She bolted out of the car and into the house, locking the door behind her. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her mind racing. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house sent her heart into a frenzy. By morning, she had made her decision. Claire packed her belongings and left the house that day, unable to stay in the place where the nightmare had begun. For weeks, she avoided driving at night, and when she did, she compulsively checked her back seat, her paranoia growing with every passing day. Even now, years later, Claire cannot forget that night. The solitude she once cherished has become a source of terror. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world feels still, she hears whispers in the dark, reminding her of the passengers she left behind, and she wonders if one day he'll return. Ryan's excitement was palpable as he stepped into his new apartment. It was perfect in every way: affordable rent, plenty of space, and within walking distance of his job. The building had an old-world charm, with creaky wooden floors and tall windows that let in an abundance of sunlight during the day. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a warm but slightly strained smile, had shown him around, mentioning only one peculiar rule. "Never go into the basement," the landlord had said, his tone firm but casual. "It's locked anyway, so you won't have to worry about it. Just some old junk down there, nothing to fuss over." Ryan had chuckled and nodded. He wasn't the type to pry, and honestly, he had no interest in dusty basements. His focus was on unpacking and turning the apartment into a home. By the time he finished arranging his belongings and setting up his furniture, exhaustion took over. That first night, he slept deeply, undisturbed by the groans and creaks of the aging building. But the second night was different. As Ryan lay in bed scrolling through his phone, he heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was subtle at first, like the rhythmic drumming of rain against a window. But as he turned off his phone and listened closely, he realized the sound was coming from beneath him. Confused, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and pressed his ear to the floor. The sound was steady, deliberate, almost like a signal. A chill ran down his spine. His curiosity got the better of him and he tapped back 3 quick raps against the wooden floorboards. The tapping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against his eardrums. Uneasy, Ryan climbed back into bed, convincing himself it was just the pipes or maybe even mice scurrying through the walls. The next morning, he brought it up casually to the landlord. "Mice, probably," the landlord said with a dismissive shrug. "These old buildings have their quirks. I'll send someone to check it out." Ryan nodded, though the landlord's explanation didn't sit well with him. That night, as he lay in bed, the tapping returned. This time it was louder and seemed to move, starting near his bed and traveling along the floor toward the wall that separated his apartment from the forbidden basement. The sound was relentless, growing more insistent with each passing minute. Ryan's heart raced as he sat up, straining to pinpoint the source. By midnight, his nerves were shot. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured out of his apartment and made his way down the dimly lit hallway to the basement door. The air grew colder as he approached, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over him. The door was solid wood with a rusted padlock securing it. But what caught Ryan's attention were the scratches around the lock. They were jagged and deep, as though someone had clawed at the door in a desperate attempt to escape. He took a step back, his breathing uneven. The urge to open the door was overwhelming, but the landlord's warning echoed in his mind. Shaking his head, he hurried back to his apartment and locked the door behind him. He tried to sleep, but every creak of the building felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to shift. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Groggy and apprehensive, he picked it up. The screen displayed a message from an unknown number. "Let me out." Ryan stared at the words, his stomach twisting into knots. His first thought was that it was a prank. He typed back a hesitant response. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm still here, behind the wall." The phone slipped from his trembling hands. His mind raced. Was someone in the basement? How could they have his number? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud, jarring bang that reverberated through the building. The sound was unmistakable. It came from the basement. Adrenaline surged through Ryan as he grabbed his flashlight and dialed the police. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to soothe his frayed nerves as he explained the situation. Within minutes, red and blue lights illuminated the street outside, and 2 officers arrived at the scene. "Stay here," one of them instructed as they approached the basement door, guns drawn. Ryan watched from a safe distance, his heart pounding in his chest. The lock on the basement door had been broken, the heavy padlock dangling uselessly from the latch. One officer pushed the door open, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. The stench that wafted out was unbearable, a mix of mildew and something far more rancid. The officers disappeared into the shadows, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Ryan waited, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, the officers emerged, their faces pale and grim. "You said you just moved in," one of them asked, his tone sharp. Ryan nodded. "What did you find?" The officer hesitated before answering. "There's evidence someone was living down there. An old mattress, chains, claw marks on the walls. Whoever it was, they're not there now, but it's clear they were locked in." Ryan's blood ran cold. Chains? Claw marks? The image sent shivers down his spine. "What do you mean they're not there now? Where did they go?" The officer didn't answer, instead exchanging a troubled glance with his partner. "You should probably find somewhere else to stay tonight," he said finally. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He packed a bag, leaving behind most of his belongings, and drove to a nearby motel. Sleep eluded him as he replayed the events of the night over and over in his mind. The landlord didn't answer his calls the next day, and when Ryan returned to the apartment to retrieve his things, the basement door was boarded up. Curiosity nagged at him, but fear kept him from investigating further. Who had been locked in that basement? Why had the landlord been so adamant about keeping it off limits? And most haunting of all, where had they gone? Ryan moved out of the apartment permanently, but the experience left a lasting scar. Even now, in the safety of a new home, he finds himself glancing over his shoulder, dreading the day he might hear a tap, tap, tap once more. Jack sat alone in his dimly lit office, the glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across the room. The city outside was eerily silent, the usual bustle reduced to faint murmurs and the occasional distant horn. It was well past midnight, and he was the only one left on the floor. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the fatigue as he stared at the spreadsheet on his screen. The sudden shrill ring of his phone startled him. Frowning, he glanced at the screen. The number was unlisted. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" His voice was tired, laced with irritation. For a moment there was silence on the other end. Then, a whisper. Barely audible but unmistakably desperate. "Help me!" Jack straightened in his chair. "Who is this? "Are you okay?" he asked, his pulse quickening. The line crackled. The voice returned, trembling and faint. "They're coming. Please, help me." "Oh, who's coming?" Jack demanded, his voice rising. He glanced at the clock on his desk, as if grounding himself to the present. "Where are you? I can call the police." The line went dead. Jack pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at it, his heart racing. He immediately tried calling the number back, but an automated message informed him that the number did not exist. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. "A prank call," he muttered, placing the phone back on his desk. But as he returned to his work, the faint echo of the woman's voice lingered in his mind. An hour passed, and just as he began to feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at his eyelids, the phone rang again. This time the sound sent a jolt of fear through him. He stared at the screen. Once again, the number was unlisted. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the device. Finally, he picked it up. "Hello?" he said cautiously. The voice on the other end was trembling, frantic. "They're inside now. Please, you have to help me, please." Jack's blood ran cold. "Listen, tell me where you are," he urged, trying to keep his voice steady. I can get you help. I can call someone." A muffled sob came through the line, followed by the distinct creak of a door opening. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. A guttural growl followed, deep and unnatural. "Run!" Jack shouted into the phone. But it was too late. The line went silent except for the sound of slow, steady breathing. The breath was raspy, inhuman. Jack held the phone tightly, frozen in his chair. Then, a man's voice, low and mocking, spoke. "You shouldn't have answered." The call ended abruptly. Jack's hands trembled as he placed the phone on the desk. He stared at it, willing it not to ring again. But the phone buzzed moments later. This time, it was a message. Hesitantly, he opened it. The message contained a single photo. It showed his office building, the lights in his floor, his office clearly illuminated. The photo had been taken from the parking lot below. Jack's breath quickened. He stood, glancing toward the office window. The blinds were drawn, but the thought of someone standing outside, watching him, sent a shiver down his spine. He grabbed his keys and his jacket, shoving his phone into his pocket. The work could wait. He needed to leave. The elevator ride down was agonizingly slow. Each ding of the floors passing felt like a hammer to his chest. When the doors finally slid open to the lobby, Jack's eyes darted around, scanning the empty space. The security guard's desk was vacant, the chair turned slightly to the side. Pushing through the glass doors, Jack jogged to his car, the cool night air biting at his face. He unlocked the vehicle with trembling hands and climbed inside, locking the doors immediately. Just as he started the engine, his phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with another message. His stomach churned as he opened it. It was another photo. This one was taken from inside his car, from the passenger seat. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he turned, his eyes darting to the empty seat beside him. There was no one there. But the implication was clear. His hands fumbled as he shifted the car into drive, the tires screeching as he sped out of the parking lot. The streets were empty as he drove, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. The city lights blurred as he pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring in protest. His phone buzzed again, and he nearly jumped out of his seat. He glanced at the screen. Another message. "You can't outrun this." Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was it a prank? But the fear felt too real, too visceral. And the photos, no prankster could... Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jack slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. He stared, wide-eyed, as the figure slowly turned to face him. The man was tall and unnaturally still, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes, they glowed faintly in the darkness, piercing through Jack's soul. Before Jack could react, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving only the empty road ahead. Jack's hands shook as he gripped the wheel. He pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever he had just seen. But no matter how far he drove, the sense of being watched never left him. Hours later, Jack's car was found abandoned on a desolate stretch of road, the engine still running. The driver's seat was empty, and there was no sign of him anywhere nearby. His phone lay on the passenger seat, the screen cracked but still lit. The last entry in his call log was an incoming call from his own number. Jack was never seen again. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved. But those who hear the story often find themselves glancing at their phones late at night, dreading the possibility of their own last phone call. Emily stood at the edge of the driveway, staring up at the creaky old Victorian house that now belonged to her. Its towering spires reached into the cloudy sky, and the chipped paint on the exterior seemed to peel back like dried skin. The house had a presence, an eerie, silent aura that made even the wind seem reluctant to pass through. Despite this, Emily felt a strange pull toward it, as if the house was calling her home. "It just needs a little love," she muttered under her breath, gripping the keys tightly in her hand. She turned to the moving truck and began unloading boxes. The house, inherited after her grandmother's death, had been vacant for years, and the layers of dust on every surface told the story of its abandonment. Her family's warnings echoed in her mind. "It's not safe to live there alone," her uncle had said, his tone unusually stern. When she pressed him for details, he refused to elaborate, brushing it off with vague comments about the house's age and condition. Emily chalked it up to superstition. The small-town gossip about the house being haunted had only made her more curious. By the time she finished unpacking, it was well into the evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long across the rooms. Emily walked through the sprawling living room, her footsteps echoing faintly. Despite the dim lighting and the faint, musty smell, she felt an odd sense of comfort. She decided to call it an early night and climbed the winding staircase to the master bedroom. The first night was uneventful, mostly. Emily woke once to the sound of faint creaking, but she brushed it off as the old house settling. The second night, however, was different. She had just turned off the lights when she heard it. Whispers. Whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she lay in bed, straining to listen, she realized the whispers were coming from inside the walls. They were faint, unintelligible, but undeniably human. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. She turned on her bedside lamp and scanned the room. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost as if the house were holding its breath. Emily shook her head, forcing herself to lie back down. "Just my imagination," she told herself. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she decided to explore the house more thoroughly. Perhaps there were old vents or drafty gaps in the walls causing the noises. She moved from room to room, tapping on the walls and inspecting the floorboards. In one of the guest bedrooms, she found a loose floorboard. Beneath it was an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked with age, and the pages inside were filled with frantic, barely legible writing. One phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "Don't Listen to them. Emily's unease grew, but she pushed it aside. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only response was the faint groan of the house. Emily's grip tightened on her phone as she scanned the darkness. After a few moments, she retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She dragged a dresser in front of it for good measure. By the third night, Emily was at her wits' end. The whispers had grown louder, the footsteps more frequent, and now there was something new, a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire house. It started in the evening, a faint buzz that steadily grew in intensity as the hours passed. It wasn't like anything she'd ever heard before, a sound that seemed to burrow into her skull, making her head throb. As she paced the living room, trying to distract herself, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Her stomach churned as she read the message. "Why are you still here?" Emily's hands shook as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "We never left." Her heart pounded as she dropped the phone onto the couch. The humming suddenly stopped, leaving behind a deafening silence. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence, but the oppressive, unnatural kind that makes your ears ring. Emily froze, her eyes darting around the room. Then, the walls began to move. At first it was subtle, a faint shifting, as if the house were breathing. But within seconds, the movements became violent. The walls bowed inward, then outward, as if something inside was trying to break free. Cracks splintered across the plaster, and the floor beneath her feet trembled. A deep guttural sound erupted from the foundation, sending Emily into a frenzy. Barefoot and hysterical, she bolted out of the house. She didn't stop running until she was standing in the middle of the street, gasping for air. Behind her, the house seemed to pulse, its windows shattering one by one. A faint glow emanated from within, flickering like a dying flame. Emily didn't wait to see what would happen next. She ran to her car and sped away, tears streaming down her face. The next morning, Emily called her uncle. Her words tumbled out in frantic bursts as she recounted the events of the previous nights. He listened in silence before finally speaking. "You should have left the house alone," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "There's a reason we don't talk about it. Whatever lives there, it's been waiting." Emily tried to press him for more information, but he refused to say anything else. She never returned to the house. Over the following weeks, she put it up for sale, but no buyers came forward. The locals avoided it, whispering about its dark history. To this day, the house remains abandoned. Its windows are boarded up, its paint even more weathered. But those who pass by claim they can still hear faint whispers emanating from within, whispers that seem to grow louder if you linger too long. No one dares to stay near the house after dark, and no one ever questions why. Alex had been counting down the days to his weekend getaway. Work had been relentless, and the thought of spending 2 days in a secluded cabin deep in the woods was his only solace. No emails, no deadlines, just the calming embrace of nature and the peace he so desperately craved. The cabin, surrounded by towering pines and nestled beside a glistening lake, was miles from the nearest town. It was perfect. The first day was everything he had hoped for. Alex arrived in the early afternoon, unpacked his bags, and explored the area. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a stone fireplace and large windows that offered a view of the dense forest. He spent the evening sitting by the fire, a mug of hot coffee in his hands, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was bliss. As night fell, Alex retired to the bedroom. The bed was warm, and the soft crackle of the dying fire in the living room lulled him into a sense of security. He was drifting off to sleep when a faint knock at the door shattered the silence. His eyes flew open. He lay still, his heart pounding, straining to hear over the ringing silence that followed. Knock, knock. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Alex glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. Who could possibly be out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and he hadn't seen another soul since he arrived. Reluctantly, he climbed out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and approached the door. "Hello, who's there?" he called out, his voice betraying his unease. No answer. Alex hesitated, then slowly opened the door a crack, the cool night air brushing against his face. The porch was empty. He shone the flashlight across the yard, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Shrugging it off as perhaps a branch knocking against the cabin or an animal brushing past, Alex locked the door and returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning he found something on the porch. A small bundle wrapped in a filthy cloth lay directly in front of the door. His stomach churned as he knelt to inspect it. Unwrapping the bundle revealed a crude wooden carving of a human figure. Its craftsmanship was primitive, the wood rough and splintered. But what made Alex's skin crawl was the figure's head, or rather, the lack of it. The carving was headless. A chill ran down his spine. Alex looked around, scanning the surrounding trees. But the woods stood silent, unyielding in their stillness. Convinced it was some prank by a local, though he couldn't fathom why, he tossed the bundle into the woods and tried to shake off the unease. The day passed uneventfully, but as night fell, Alex's apprehension grew. He locked the doors and windows before settling by the fire again, trying to lose himself in a book. But the quiet of the cabin seemed oppressive, each creak of the old wood amplified in the stillness. He couldn't help but feel as though he was being watched. At midnight, the knocking returned. This time it was louder, more insistent, each thud reverberating through the cabin. Alex's pulse quickened as he stood, gripping the flashlight. "Go away!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The knocking stopped. For a moment silence returned, but it was short-lived. Alex froze as he heard it. Footsteps. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves and twigs outside. Alex grabbed a kitchen knife and inched toward the door. "Whoever you are, I'm armed," he warned, his voice shaking. Summoning his courage, he flung the door open and stepped onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The yard was empty. The footsteps had stopped. At the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its body seemed to blend with the shadows. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, as though its neck had been broken. Alex stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp. When he scrambled to pick it up and shone the beam toward the trees, the figure was gone. Panic overtook him. He rushed back inside, locking the door and barricading it with a chair. He did the same to the windows, pushing furniture against them. His hands trembled as he sat by the fireplace, gripping the knife tightly. The hours dragged on, every creak and groan of the cabin sending his heart racing. At dawn, Alex decided he couldn't stay another night. He packed his belongings in a frenzy, tossing clothes and supplies haphazardly into his bag. As he stepped onto the porch, his blood ran cold. There, in the exact spot where he had found the bundle the day before, was the wooden carving. But this time, its head had been restored. A note was tied to the figure with a piece of frayed twine. With trembling hands, Alex unfolded the scrap of paper. 4 words were scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You should have stayed inside." Alex's breath hitched. He dropped the note in carving, running to his car. The drive back to town was a blur, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the figure standing in the road behind him. He never spoke about what happened at the cabin. When friends asked how his getaway had been, he offered vague answers and quickly changed the subject. The cabin was sold a few months later, but the new owners didn't last long. They left after reporting strange noises and finding unsettling objects left on the porch. To this day, Alex refuses to enter the woods. The memory of the figure, its head tilted unnaturally, haunts his dreams. And every so often he wakes in the middle of the night, certain he hears faint knocking at his door. A reminder of the stranger at the cabin.